Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Well, begin by remembering that the Death Eaters are quite a dangerous organization of radical wizards whose goal is to cleanse the magical world of Muggle-borns and Muggles, and to preserve its pure blood identity, using rather terrifying means of influence. But the irony lies in the fact that the leader and founder of this movement was himself a half-blood, and in essence should have been a victim of the new regime he sought to establish in the magical world. The roots of this ideology go back to the time when young Tom Riddle was still a student at Hogwarts. However, the school group of Tom's supporters at that time were merely the precursors to those we now call Death Eaters. They called themselves the Knights of Walpurgis, and most of them were from Slytherin House, as this house, more than any other, has always upheld the values established by its founder, Salazar Slytherin, namely, the return of the magical community to pure blood status. For a long time, Tom Riddle knew nothing about his origins, so upon arriving at Hogwarts, he became obsessed with discovering facts that could fill this gap in his life. While searching for traces of his father at Hogwarts, he soon concluded that for some reason, Tom Riddle Sr. had never studied there. The deeper Tom delved into his lineage, the more disappointment consumed him, and by the time he turned 16, his hand did not falter as he killed his father and the rest of his Muggle family. Now, the main question arises, did Voldemort's followers actually know about his heritage? And if so, was their hatred of Muggles and devotion to the ideals of blood purity not strong enough to prevent them from following a half-blood? Did they know what Voldemort was so fervently trying to deny? But first, let's try to find evidence in the books that the Death Eaters were, in fact, aware of Voldemort's true ancestry. In The Half-Blood Prince, it is mentioned that the students close to him expressed surprise that Tom Riddle's father was a Muggle, given that Tom was a direct descendant of Salazar Slytherin. From this, we can conclude that Tom did not keep his origins a secret and did not hide the fact that he was a half-blood. Yes, he hated his origins, but he did not deny them. Another question arises here. Were these students the future Death Eaters who later fought for blood purity? We find the answer in Slughorn's words when he mentions the names of Lestrange and Avery as he bids farewell to Tom and the other members of the Slug Club after one of their meetings. In the Goblet of Fire, Voldemort gathers the Death Eaters and delivers a speech, at one point mentioning that he needed his father's bone for his rebirth. This is why the ritual took place in the graveyard of the small village of Little Hangleton, where the tomb of Tom Riddle Sr. is located. The Death Eaters who arrived there could not fail to notice that this village was clearly Muggle, and it was certainly not a place where wizards, especially purebloods, lived. So the Death Eaters realized they were in a Muggle place, saw the gravestone with Tom Riddle written on it, the very name of their master from school, and even a child could connect the dots. If any of Voldemort's followers had doubts about his origins before, they now had irrefutable evidence before them. In the Order of the Phoenix, Harry calls Voldemort by his name, driving Bellatrix into a furious rage. "How dare you speak his name? How dare you defile it with your filthy half-blood tongue?" She screams, to which Harry responds that Voldemort is also a half-blood, since his father was a Muggle. Bellatrix does not seem at all surprised by this information, leading us to assume that she was well aware of the Dark Lord's heritage. So, we have established that there are several indirect pieces of evidence suggesting that the Death Eaters were indeed aware of their future master's true blood status. Therefore, it's a very logical question to ask, why did they still follow Voldemort, even though it fundamentally contradicted their core values as members of pure-blood families? Let's explore this further. Firstly, although Voldemort was a half-blood, he was nonetheless the true heir of Salazar Slytherin, the founder of the house from which almost all the Death Eaters came. Salazar was someone who always held radical views toward Muggles, and for that, he was respected by the Slytherins, who later became Death Eaters. One could say that Voldemort, being Salazar's direct descendant, balanced out his half-blood status. Secondly, it's no secret that Voldemort renounced his family. In fact, he literally wiped out any trace of his connection to Muggles. Through his actions, he proved to be a fervent supporter of blood purity ideals and used extremely brutal methods to implement those ideas. Voldemort's passionate desire to eradicate any ties that linked him to Muggles became a clear demonstration that he was more than serious about his cause, which earned him respect and trust among the Death Eaters. Thirdly, we should not forget that Voldemort was a powerful and great wizard, skilled in occlumency and legilimency. Additionally, he was charismatic and persuasive. By the time the Death Eaters might have wanted to question or oppose him, he had already gained enough power to eliminate anyone who would dare stand against him. Fourthly, many pure-blood families, especially the Malfoys, always sought to align themselves with those who could offer them power and influence. Seeing Voldemort's growing influence, Lucius decided to strike a deal with his conscience and overlook the Dark Lord's origins, betting everything on the immense power Voldemort would grant him in the event of victory, which Lucius never doubted. This was the temptation that Lucius and many other followers of Voldemort couldn't resist. If we look at the situation through the eyes of the Death Eaters, it becomes clear that Voldemort essentially gave them two choices, either join him or die. And Death Eaters were not like Sirius Black, James Potter, or Frank Longbottom. So they chose the first option. Even though many Death Eaters, including the Malfoy family, knew about Voldemort's origins, they continued to support him out of fear, a thirst for power, and their belief in the superiority of pure-bloods. However, behind this choice lay many other complex questions and mysteries that continued to intrigue Harry Potter fans. To better understand the Death Eaters' motivations and to delve into their actions, let's move on to the most frequently asked questions that fans continue to pose about them. At what age can one become a Death Eater? The question of the age at which someone can become a Death Eater sparks much debate. The books don't provide a definitive answer, but the examples of some characters shed light on this mystery. Draco Malfoy was recruited at 15, just before his 6th year at Hogwarts. He had no choice. Voldemort used him as a tool to exact revenge on Lucius. Draco was too young to understand what lay ahead for him. Regulus Black joined the Death Eaters as a teenager. Sirius said about his brother, he was too young and proud to understand what he was getting into. Regulus received the Dark Mark shortly after leaving school. But by age 18, he betrayed Voldemort in an attempt to destroy one of the Horcruxes, with his death being the tragic price for realizing his mistake. Barty Crouch Jr. is another young Death Eater. He was around 19 when he was sent to Azkaban for torturing the Longbottom family. Barty grew up in a strict household, but chose the path of darkness. He was young, ambitious, and, like many of his peers, was seduced by promises of power. The minimum age to become a Death Eater appears to be around 15 or 16. At this age, teenagers are still vulnerable. Voldemort skillfully manipulated them by promising power. Draco was drawn into this against his will. He was forced. Voldemort wanted to punish Lucius for failing to obtain the prophecy, and Draco became a pawn in his dark game. How did so many Death Eaters avoid Azkaban the first time? After Voldemort's first downfall, many of his loyal followers miraculously avoided Azkaban. One of them was Lucius Malfoy. He claimed that he had been under the Imperius Curse the entire time. "I was being controlled," was his version of events. It was a convenient lie. Proving otherwise was nearly impossible. With his wealth and connections, Lucius easily convinced the Ministry that he was not responsible for his actions. Escaping punishment and continuing to live in luxury as if nothing had happened. The Imperius Curse became a lifeline for many Death Eaters. They all claimed the same thing, that they had been forced to obey. Lucius was one of the most cunning, but far from the only one. His wealth and power became his shield, protecting him from retribution. Other Death Eaters chose a different path. Igor Karkaroff opted for a deal. He didn't want to rot in Azkaban, so he betrayed his comrades. "I can name names," Karkaroff said in court to buy his freedom. For this betrayal, he was released. Karkaroff became headmaster of Durmstrang, but he lived in fear of vengeance for the rest of his life. Betrayal always leaves a mark. Betrayal was not uncommon. Death Eaters knew that their freedom depended on how many names they could give up. This created mistrust even among Voldemort's servants. No one knew who would be the next to betray to save their own skin. But the most unusual story is that of Severus Snape. He escaped prison not through lies or deals, but thanks to Dumbledore. Albus vouched for Snape, declaring that he had been a spy for the Order. "Severus was working for us," Dumbledore said at the trial. People believed Dumbledore, and Snape was freed. It was a unique rescue. Did the Death Eaters have a hierarchy? The Death Eaters had a strict hierarchy. At the very top stood Voldemort. He didn't just command, he ruled. His orders were unquestionable, and any mistake could cost someone their life. Voldemort kept his servants in constant fear. He who must not be named was not only a leader, but also a source of terror. Beneath him was the inner circle. Lucius Malfoy and Bellatrix Lestrange were part of this small group of trusted followers. Bellatrix worshipped Voldemort fanatically. To her, he was more than just a master, almost a god. Lucius, on the other hand, was a pragmatist. He cared about his family and tried to balance his service to Voldemort with protecting his own interests. But both were at the forefront, carrying out the Dark Lord's most important missions. The Dark Mark was a symbol of loyalty. It wasn't just a mark, it was a brand that bound the bearer to Voldemort. He could summon the Death Eaters at any moment. But the mark wasn't given to everyone. Only the most devoted received it. Those who bore it had responsibilities and knew that the mark was not a privilege, but an eternal obligation. However, there were also those who served Voldemort without the mark. They operated in the shadows. Peter Pettigrew was one such person. Before he brought Voldemort back to life, he did not bear the mark. But that didn't stop him from serving the Dark Lord. There were many like him, carrying out dirty work without drawing attention. What was Peter Pettigrew's status? Peter Pettigrew, known as Wormtail, played a pivotal role in the downfall of the Potters. He betrayed his friends, becoming their secret keeper, and revealed their location to Voldemort. This betrayal changed the course of the wizarding world. Voldemort found the Potters, and the world was plunged into chaos, all because of Pettigrew's cowardly act. Later, he once again became a key figure. Voldemort's resurrection was also on his hands. In the Goblet of Fire, Pettigrew performed the ritual that restored the Dark Lord to full strength. He even sacrificed his hand for it. You would think such a feat would have elevated his status among the Death Eaters, but it didn't. The Death Eaters despised him. Bellatrix and others looked at him with disgust. A pathetic traitor. That's what they called him behind his back. To them, he was a coward who betrayed his friends for his own gain. No one believed he was capable of anything more than servitude. Even Voldemort didn't truly value him. After the ritual, he rewarded Pettigrew with a silver hand, but it was more a gesture of condescension. Voldemort saw him as a tool to be used, but did not respect him. Pettigrew always remained on the fringes, among those who were never fully trusted. How does the Dark Mark work? The Dark Mark is a brand worn by the most loyal Death Eaters. It not only symbolized their devotion, but also bound them to Voldemort completely. From the moment it appeared on their arm, the mark became part of their essence, showing that they were no longer free. Voldemort used it for control, and the Death Eaters couldn't escape its magical power. The mark was much more than just a symbol. Voldemort could summon his followers simply by touching his own mark. The other Death Eaters would instantly feel a burning pain on their arms. This was an order to come to the Dark Lord immediately. Ignoring the call meant certain death. When Voldemort summoned his servants, they knew they couldn't defy this command. No letters, no words, just a searing pain on their skin, and they had to appear. This is exactly how, in the Goblet of Fire, the Death Eaters gathered at the graveyard after his resurrection. The mark connected them directly to Voldemort, making them obedient puppets. But the mark also reflected Voldemort's strength. When he was weakened after attacking Harry, the mark began to fade. Death Eaters like Karkaroff noticed this with growing concern. When the mark started to darken again, it meant only one thing: Voldemort was returning. It was a signal they couldn't ignore. Why did certain characters receive the Dark Mark? The Dark Mark was not just a symbol of loyalty. It was a tool of control that Voldemort used to keep those he didn't fully trust in check. Severus Snape, Peter Pettigrew, and Draco Malfoy are prime examples of how the mark served as a means for the Dark Lord to monitor them and suppress their will. Snape received the mark when he was young and became a Death Eater. He sought power and proximity to Voldemort. But later, he switched sides and joined the Order of the Phoenix. Despite his betrayal, Voldemort continued to trust him. For Snape, the mark wasn't so much a sign of loyalty as a chain that kept him under control. Even as he played his double game, the mark remained a symbol of danger. Peter Pettigrew received the mark after he helped bring Voldemort back to life. Even his fellow Death Eaters didn't trust him. The mark became a tool of control for Pettigrew. Voldemort couldn't allow him to betray him again as he had with the Potters. It kept him in fear and submission. Draco Malfoy was very young when he received the Dark Mark. It wasn't a reward. Voldemort used him to punish Lucius for his failure. For Draco, the mark became a curse. He wasn't seeking power, but found himself drawn into a dangerous game. Voldemort assigned him the task of killing Dumbledore, and the mark served as a reminder that he had no choice. For all three, the mark was not only a sign of loyalty, it made them vulnerable. Snape, Pettigrew, and Draco could have been spies or traitors, and Voldemort knew it. The mark was his way of keeping them in line, preventing any attempts to switch sides. How did the Death Eaters gain such power? The Death Eaters didn't become powerful by chance. Their strength was rooted in ancient pureblood families that had been accumulating wealth and influence for centuries. The Malfoys, Blacks, Lestranges, these families used their money and power to advance Voldemort's interests. Lucius Malfoy, for example, manipulated officials through his connections in the ministry, ensuring he remained unpunished. The wealth of these families opened many doors. Money allowed the Death Eaters to control things behind the scenes and bribe the right people. They not only provided financial support, but also infiltrated the corridors of power, where they could influence policy. Lucius was a master at this generous donations, and bribes kept many under his control. Penetrating the Ministry of Magic was a key factor. The Death Eaters didn't just infiltrate it there, they subjugated many officials. The Imperious Curse was their main weapon. With this spell, they turned influential wizards into their puppets. No one knew who could be trusted. The Imperious Curse gave the Death Eaters covert control over the Ministry. Wizards, without even realizing it, carried out Voldemort's orders. This undermined resistance from within and gave the Death Eaters access to resources that no one could oppose. Politics and laws became tools in their hands. But the blind stubbornness of the authorities helped the Death Eaters even more. Minister Fudge refused to acknowledge the threat. He simply didn't believe in Voldemort's return. "You're mistaken, Dumbledore," he kept saying, as the Dark Lord was already gaining power. This denial allowed the Death Eaters to operate freely. Why didn't any of the Death Eaters finish off Harry? Despite the threat Harry Potter posed, none of the Death Eaters dared to kill him. The reason is simple. Voldemort forbade it. "Only I can kill him," said the Dark Lord. He was convinced that the prophecy tied their fates together, and only he had the right to destroy Harry. Anyone who dared disobey this order would face a terrible punishment. Even when they had the chance to kill Harry, the Death Eaters hesitated. They knew that Voldemort wouldn't forgive disobedience. During the Battle of Hogwarts, they could have captured him, but they waited for the command. Their fear of Voldemort was stronger than their desire to finish off Harry. Additionally, Harry was protected by magic created by Lily's sacrifice. This ancient spell prevented Voldemort or his followers from touching him. Even Voldemort feared this magic. The Death Eaters were aware of the protection and avoided taking risks, unwilling to confront its power. This protection also extended to the Dursley home, where Harry lived. As long as he was there, the Death Eaters couldn't get close to him. They understood that any attack could end in disaster. Lily's magical protection made Harry nearly untouchable. But it wasn't just magic and fear of Voldemort that held them back. The Death Eaters were motivated by self-interest. Killing Harry meant defying Voldemort's orders and risking their lives. Lucius Malfoy, for example, was too cautious and preferred to stay away. For him, preserving his family and status was more important. Every Death Eater knew that killing Harry would bring nothing but trouble. There was no benefit to it. They knew Voldemort wanted to handle it himself. No one wanted to lose their position. for the sake of questionable glory. Thanks for watching until the end. I hope that means you found this interesting. If so, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel.